Afternoon, AgencyIQ and Politico subscribers and supporters. We are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Colleen Connolly, and I am the Managing Director of Member Services for AgencyIQ here at Politico. It's so nice to be with you this afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. As the flurry of the election results begin to settle in while COVID-19 continues to increasingly impact us all on a daily basis, it could be argued that there has never been a more critical time for the life sciences industry to gain vision into the FDA today and into 2021. So the Agency IQ content team has a unique opportunity to share their insight and perspective about what's to come in light of the continued COVID-19 crisis and what welcoming a new administration at the beginning of 2021 will mean for the life sciences industry. One quick note on the presenters today. Unfortunately, Politico healthcare reporter David Lim was pulled out about 10 minutes ago to cover some breaking news, we believe, within the appropriations space that is happening as we speak. We apologize that he cannot make it, but we are very glad that he is doing his due diligence in monitoring that situation. Throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A function or submit questions to me directly through the chat. Again, Colleen Connolly. Additionally, we will attempt to save time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. If your question is not answered, I will certainly be in touch following the presentation to connect you with a member of our team who can help get you the answer that you need. And lastly, at the end of our conversation, if time allows, we will take a couple minutes to highlight ways in which we are opening up preview access to Agency IQ as we look to expand our subscriber base. We're closing out our inaugural year here, having launched in January of 2020, and we'd love to add additional subscribers to our service. We also know it's a critical time to be gaining access to this type of information, and so we want to make sure that you have all of the relevant information on how you can become a subscriber. So stay tuned at the end to learn more about AIQ. And with that, I will turn it over to Alec Gaffney to get us started.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Colleen, and it's great to be here. My name is Alec Gaffney. I'm the head of research here at AgencyIQ. I'm joined by one of my esteemed colleagues, Laura DiAngelo, who is kind of our medical device and diagnostics guru on the AgencyIQ team. We've got a great presentation for you today, and we're going to be covering things in the same level of depth that I think many of you know us to do on a regular basis. But we're going to be looking at a few things in particular. One is what's next for the FDA from an operational and staffing perspective. We know that some of the key questions that folks have are around who's going to be commissioner, what are some of the issues that the FDA is going to be dealing with within the transition period and the start of a Biden administration. We're going to be looking at the policies that a Biden administration might seek to enact and some of the limitations that a Biden administration might find itself in, including a divided Congress. We're also going to be looking ahead to 2021 and some of the issues that are likely to be facing the FDA, regardless of who's in office there in the office of the commissioner. And then, of course, as Colleen said, we're going to be leaving plenty of time for questions. Please, as you have them, feel free to put them out there. As many of you know from past webinars, we are typically able to answer some very, very specific questions because the FDA is basically all we focus on here. So good luck, and please don't be shy about asking those questions. So without any further ado, let's get started. I think the key question that I keep hearing again and again is about what's next for the FDA. And I know one of the kind of ways that folks have been thinking about this is like, well, what is the FDA going to do across an entire Biden administration? And I think that's the wrong way to think about this. Rather, we need to think about things in stages and phases for the FDA, because as a new president comes into office, they're not able to just hit the ground running at 100 miles an hour. Rather, you need to build up speed, inertia, get the right people into place. And you also need to deal with the fact that there is an outgoing presidential administration. President Trump is still president until January 20th, when President-elect Joe Biden will be inaugurated and made president. So there are lots of different things we need to think through here. I think the first phase that I'm paying attention to is the Trump exit phase. And the key question on my mind is, Do we see FDA Commissioner Hahn stay in and stay on as commissioner, kind of running through the finish line up until the day that President Biden is inaugurated? Or do we see, as we did yesterday with Defense Secretary Mark Esper, is Hahn kind of summarily fired by tweet? And there's certainly a lot of indications to think that maybe he's not going to be staying on that much longer. It's no secret, I think, that President Trump has been, how may we say, irked with Commissioner Hahn over these past few months regarding hydroxychloroquine, some of the press scandals that have kind of gone on with respect to positioning with Peter Marks and how he has kind of put the FDA's guidance out on vaccines without the White House's explicit approval. And now with very high quality data coming out from Pfizer just a few days after the election, it seems likely that President Trump is not necessarily in a mood to entertain Hahn in that position for that much longer. I think it's also worth asking what President Trump and his administration leave to Biden. Is this going to be something where there is a clean handoff, where there is a great deal of cooperation in a presidential administration period, or are things going to be a little rough, a little choppy? Are there going to be kind of stonewalling of requests for information or access to documents? From what I've seen so far, it seems likely that it's not going to be business as usual, that there may be a bit of a choppy transition for us to deal with. Finally, I think it's also worth wondering, are we going to see a government shutdown as early as December? There is a budget appropriations process that's going on. However, that runs out quite soon. While it certainly would beg our belief to shut down the US government at a time when it's trying to respond to the coronavirus, stranger things have happened in such a politicized environment. So shifting on from the Trump exit phase, there is this overlap here with a Biden transition and coming into office. I think traditionally, when you're thinking about a presidential administration coming in and transitioning in, the FDA is very, very rarely at the top of that list. Typically, it's who's going to be defense secretary, who's going to be head of the Department of State, or things like that. FDA is typically very far down the list. In a pandemic, though, we're in this unusual situation in which the FDA is actually at the top of that list. So I think what we've seen so far is President-elect Biden has been moving very, very quickly to start thinking about who is going to be assuming that position, what's needed. And if you look at his transition team, there are some high-ranking former FDA officials among that very close core group of transition advisors. David Kessler, who is a former FDA commissioner, is, I believe, co-chair of that transition process, at least as it relates to COVID and COVID planning. You also have Luciano Borio, who is formerly I believe, acting chief scientist of the FDA and has a wealth of experience on bioterrorism and medical countermeasures policy. So between the two of them, I would expect them to kind of have a good, nuanced understanding of how the FDA works, what's needed, and hopefully get a good list of candidates for people who can step into that role very soon. I think another thing to kind of focus on within this transition period is, as Joe Biden prepares to assume office, are there tasks, are there executive orders, are there directives that are likely to be planned for day one when he comes into office? Those are the sorts of things that typically start taking shape over the next few months, and something that we can expect to start hearing a lot more of quite soon. And the next phase that I think we should be looking at is Biden in year one. And I would differentiate that between like Biden in year 2 and 4, because those early days are typically when you have, as a new president-elect, a lot of political capital to spend, a lot of things that you can be doing. And there's a little bit of quick inertia as you seek to take the reins of government and figure out exactly how you want to bend or shape or break it to your will as a president-elect. I think COVID-19 is going to take up clearly the majority of Biden's both time and political capital in responding to that and getting things in place. I think from an FDA perspective, what's interesting, though, is much of what the FDA has needed to do kind of took place a little bit earlier on in the pandemic. That was getting policies and guidance into place, getting a lot of these products reviewed for the first time, getting devices and diagnostics in particular up and running. What we've seen now from the FDA is there's a little bit less to do, which means there's also a little bit less in kind of the art of the possible for the FDA to be shaping or changing last minute. The roadmap is out there, and to the extent that it gets changed, that can actually do a little bit more harm than good. But I am personally expecting to see kind of a flurry of executive activities, at least surrounding transparency, scientific integrity, and rebuilding the FDA's reputation. And in fact, Peter Marks was giving an interview the other day to Prevision Policy, in which they were saying, transparency and trust is something we're focused very, very much on. And after the presidential transition, this is something that we're going to continue to stay laser focused on. And then, of course, there are non-COVID things as well. And I think, and we'll talk about this a bit more, but the user fee acts are going to be really top of mind for the president in that first year, because they come up for a final reauthorization in 2022. 2021 is when we're going to see a lot of these really coming in. So let me move on in the interest of time. So what does the election mean for FDA staffing? There's a lot of different things that we should be paying attention to. One, and perhaps this is last year, but should probably be first, is the commissioner. And we'll devote a lot more time to this next. But as I said, will Hahn stay on? Does he get fired? And if he is let go, who steps into that role? So hold that thought in mind. We'll get to that next. Center leadership, though, I think the FDA over time has shown itself to be fairly resilient across administrations in terms of who are the people at the top of these centers actually running things. Peter Marks has been there for quite a while. Jeff Shuren has been there for more than a decade. And while Janet Woodcock is currently over at the Operation Warp Speed, kind of running therapeutic development, it's entirely possible that she comes back at some point in the next year. In the meantime, Patrizia Cavazzoni is there as acting head of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research on an acting or interim basis. So I would expect all of those people to remain there in office under a Biden administration, unless there's some radical change or something that gets kind of unearthed in the documents in the transition period. It seems like they are kind of well entrenched there. I think burnout, though, is something that's of concern at levels lower than the center director level. And we've heard this a lot, especially from the diagnostics crew with Tim Stenzel and Toby Lowe, for example, two officials who lit up the diagnostics office, saying that their people have been working extraordinary hours, very few breaks. And I think a lot of FDA staffers during the pandemic have just been going flat out. And the real question for me is, do some of these people start looking at a presidential administration changeover and going, you know what, it's finally time, there's a new administration in office, they may prioritize science or integrity a little bit more in tune with their particular individual values? And is it a good time for them to start handing over the reins to some other people? So there may be some churn associated with that. There's also likely to be some changeover in the office of the commissioner. Anytime a new commissioner comes into office, as Stephen Hahn did, they like to surround themselves with people they can know and trust, people who are offering them policy advice. However, that also means when that commissioner leaves, many of those people also leave as well. So we may see some changeover in the office of the commissioner there. Policy officials, though, is something that I don't think was necessarily on our radar as of a few weeks ago, but you likely saw that President Trump had issued an executive order that would make it easier for the administration to fire some of these policy officials if they were deemed to not essentially be playing ball with the administration. It's my expectation that a Biden administration would likely take that back, and I think that's important for a lot of FDA policy officials in particular, who are seen as kind of going against the president with the release of that vaccine guidance document just a few weeks ago. Another thing that I'm looking at, and maybe this is the polar opposite of that burnout effect, would be the Biden effect. And we saw this a little bit in the Obama administration, where when you have a new administration, there's very often a chance where people go, you know what, this administration reflects my personal values and I want to get in to help, in this case, maybe rebuild the FDA or HHS after the Trump years. Now is my time to kind of commit to service to my country. So it may be that the FDA actually finds it rather easy to replace some of these outgoing people as folks try and get into the administration. Now, as anyone who has ever dealt with government officials know, there is a steep learning curve for them knowing and learning their job, let alone going into a pandemic in which they need to be operating at a very, very high level of proficiency. So that could lead to some operational challenges. So I told you to hold the thought about the FDA commissioner, and I want to start looking at that a little bit more because that tends to be another massive question that we keep hearing. Who's going to be FDA commissioner, and what's the list of names? So before I get to that part, what I want to start thinking about is the FDA commissioner position in the abstract. What are the qualities that make for a really good, or at least minimally competent FDA commissioner? And to be sure, there's a long list here, and traditional qualities are kind of those you see in this black column here. They typically have a scientific or medical background. And if you think about Commissioner Gottlieb, has a medical degree. If you think about former Commissioner Bob Califf, came from the Duke Clinical Research Center, massive amount of expertise in clinical trials and science. Peggy Hamburg came from the New York State Department of Health, medical degree, so on and so forth. So pretty much everyone in that position has some very esteemed medical credentials and typically a very solid research background as well. Typically, they have some sort of experience with either public health or the industry in which they're hoping to regulate. So again, Bob Califf, working at Duke, worked with many of the companies through a clinical trials enterprise. Some FDA commissioners have also had prior FDA experience, like Scott Gottlieb, who was an assistant commissioner prior to joining the FDA as commissioner, and that undoubtedly helped him pretty well, in part because one of the key qualities that makes for a good commissioner is experience with large bureaucratic organizations. The FDA has around 17,000 staffers under its roof. And right now, you know, it's not like a new FDA commissioner can go into FDA's campus on White Oak and just walk around to the various different offices, poke his head in and say, hi, I'm the new commissioner, if most of those staff are working from home. So it's going to be a little bit of a learning curve, and having that experience is certainly helpful. Political savvy as well. And you've heard likely some discussion about how this is one of the qualities that Stephen Hahn did not have coming into office. If you don't know who the key leaders are in, say, the Senate Help Committee or the House E&C Committee or other people within the administration, it takes a long time to build up those networks. And if you don't have them, it means that you're not well represented in all the rooms that you're not in Washington. And that's a huge and critical aspect and asset to have during this pandemic, when you're not going to be in a lot of those physical rooms when they're all happening over Zoom or other webinars. Familiarity with FDA too, extremely familiar, in part because on day one, when you get in there, it's a steep learning curve. And if you don't know either the key players or personnel or just the policies that you have at your disposal, it makes it that much more difficult to kind of answer questions confidently and put on the face of the agency and represent it as forcefully as you need to. So I'll stop there on the traditional side. I think COVID era qualities are the other half of this, where I think had you traditionally met all of the traditional ones, you would have been a fine FDA commissioner. But now, in the midst of the pandemic, I think more is going to be asked of any prospective FDA nominee. They're going to probably need to have epidemiological or public health experience. They're going to need to be in a position where they can rebuild trust for the agency. They're going to need to be able to get up to speed extremely quickly, and deep familiarity with the FDA and its authorities and its precedents is going to be more critical than ever, especially as Congress is likely going to start looking into the FDA and kind of taking a postmortem. Were there scandals? What changes need to be made? It's kind of a wartime footing for the FDA. And then kind of the ability to lead extremely quickly. As I was saying before, if you don't have a familiarity with how the FDA has already done things, it's going to be tough to get up that learning curve as quickly as you might want to. So I think all that being said, who could lead the FDA? Well, there's been a little bit of a shortage of information, but there are some things that we've heard, and there are some things that I want to kind of talk through my thought process here. One is, as we've said, short term, it seems likely that Stephen Hahn is probably not going to be serving out the remainder of this term through January 2020, which means very likely we're going to be talking about who comes in on an interim basis, either to lead the FDA until a FDA official is Senate confirmed. And remember that the FDA does need to have Senate confirmed leadership. And there are a few kind of names that I would like to float here for your consideration. I think by policy, the FDA needs to, or is supposed to appoint their commissioner of food and veterinary medicine, who right now is Frank Yiannis, who's been with the FDA for quite a while and is very well known for his interest and expertise in supply chains. However, there are some other officials who are associated with Operation Warp Speed and the administration's current response to COVID. That includes Ned Sharpless, who is already interim FDA commissioner. In fact, I think he may have exceeded the amount of time that he can serve, although I'm not an expert in that particular part of FDA policy. So it's possible he may come back. He's currently the head of the National Cancer Institute. There's also Janet Woodcock, who many of you know is the longtime director of FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research and is currently closely affiliated with Operation Warp Speed. You have Brett Giroir, who is actually acting FDA commissioner for all of 3 days before Stephen Hahn was actually confirmed. So it's possible that he, and he's currently involved very heavily in the administration's response as it relates to his position as testing czar for the US. Possible he may step back in quickly. There are also some current FDA officials who may be able to step in on an acting basis, including Amy Abernathy, who is currently deputy commissioner for the FDA. Anand Shah, who is the, I believe, chief medical officer at the FDA and has previously served at CMS and kind of knows his way around the federal government. And also Denise Hinton, who is currently the FDA's chief scientific officer. So there are lots of options for at least leadership on an interim basis. I think permanent leadership, though, speaks to a more difficult question and one which raises a couple key issues. And I was talking with Laura about this a little bit earlier, but if you're President-elect Joe Biden, do you bring on an FDA leader who's going to be amazing at COVID and then maybe less good for all of the FDA administration's long-term priorities as relates to non-COVID things? Maybe it's oncology or other things like that. Or do you find someone who can do both the COVID response and all of the other FDA activities long-term? And I think there are some people who can do both, but by and large, they are somewhat distinct skill sets for some individuals, which may make it all the more difficult to find someone who's able to step into this role on a permanent basis. Now, there have been a few names mentioned among the rumor mill. I will caution and say that transition period rumor mills are just that, and very often it's people leaking their own name to the press that they've been talking to administration officials or incoming administration officials, and that's how their names get out there. But the two that I've heard most often are Johns Hopkins Chancellor of Health, Josh Sharfstein, who was previously at the FDA in a, I believe, deputy commissioner position under Peggy Hamburg in the Obama years for about a year, and also Amy Abernathy, who's been with the FDA now for a few years. Abernathy is well known for being very well respected as it relates to real world evidence, data, and digital health. However, the key question is, can she also do COVID things? And is this kind of the right opportunity? So remember back to that question, do you need someone who can do both COVID and non-COVID, or are you looking for someone who can be with you on day one and be with you for the rest of kind of your administration? So let's shift gears a little bit and start bringing in Laura to this conversation as well. We've talked a lot about who and what these changes might look like. Now let's start talking about Biden's policy agenda and the FDA. I think there's been a little bit that we've heard, but as I'm thinking about this in terms of a framework of Biden comes in office, what is he looking to do? For me, it's three things. It's looking to build up in areas where he has his own policies. It's looking to rebuild in areas where he thinks that the Trump administration may have gotten it maybe halfway right, but wants to put his own stamp on a particular policy. And then, of course, dismantling certain policies where maybe he just doesn't agree with it at all. I think the good news for the FDA in general is there's probably not going to be a whole lot of rebuilding or dismantling for much of the Trump administration. And I think Scott Gottlieb gets a lot of credit for this. The administration was, FDA rather, was seen as kind of a nonpartisan, neutral, just going straight by the book agency that didn't get a whole lot of criticism, was mostly doing policies in the same vein as it did under the Obama administration, and didn't let politics interfere too much. So with the exception of the last year when we really started transitioning to maybe election time activities and COVID-19, there's probably not a whole lot that gets touched before that time. Now, however, there are a few things that I think probably are ripe to be modified. And Laura, I want to shoot this one over to you. We've seen recently that there's been some disagreements between FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services as it relates to a policy on diagnostics, and in particular, laboratory developed tests. Can you explain kind of what that tension between FDA and HHS has been, and where Biden might seek to either dismantle a policy or repair it in an entirely different new way?
For sure. So this would be the August policy from HHS directing FDA to not require emergency use authorizations for laboratory developed tests, a subset of diagnostics. And then FDA's later interpretation of that policy being that they would decline to review all emergency use authorizations from laboratory entities. And kind of the positive of these things coming out in the way that they did, which is pretty much as website updates, is that much like an executive order, it can be undone via a website update. So right now, the LDT policy from the FDA only lives in frequently asked questions. So as far as how Biden's administration will kind of take a look at this, I think this will go back to, Alec, what you were saying, kind of more of a deference to scientists and the established kind of rank and file of the FDA, putting FDA more kind of in charge of its own precedent and the policies in which it enacts. So HHS did leave a fairly large path forward for the FDA, saying that they could do notice and comment rulemaking to put their authority kind of back to where it was, which we know that the FDA has some regulatory language from 2014 that could potentially be reworked into a rule. But as far as how the FDA could move forward from this point with new leadership, as the policy only exists in an FAQ at this particular time and guidance hasn't been updated really comprehensively, the path forward for this, I think, will depend very much on who ends up in the leadership at the FDA.
Great point. And, we've gotten some questions since we started, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to kind of work in some of the answers to those within this broader framework, especially around this center point around rebuilding. We've seen, for example, Joe Biden has indicated his support for drug importation from Canada. And it's possible that the Biden administration, rather than revoking what the Trump administration has tried to do through the FDA on drug importation, rather seeks to modify that process or enact some additional proposed rules or final rules. There's a lot that I think the Biden administration could do to tinker around with some of these. And we've gotten a few kind of related questions, one of which was, what position do you expect the Biden administration to take with a list of essential medicines and the efforts to have more of the supply chain coming from American-controlled manufacturing sites? I think Biden is, if not exactly the same as the Trump administration, at least directionally similar. There may be some, again, tinkering around the edges here, but I think on balance, the Biden administration has indicated that it is strongly in support of buy American, make American, especially as it relates to medicines, personal protective equipment, and other essential medical products here in the US. So when I was looking at the FDA's list of essential medicines the other week, it didn't seem all that controversial. It didn't seem like, at least to me on first glance, like that was something that the Trump administration had strongly put its thumb on the scale and kind of perverted the systems by which the administration would normally operate. And it's entirely possible that the Biden administration is going to seek to continue on that path. Again, maybe with some minor modifications, maybe with some additional transparency, but by and large the same. We received another question. You didn't touch on some of the things HHS has done to reduce regulation and make it more difficult for FDA to issue enforcement and guidance. I'm assuming these moves will be reversed and we'll see a bit of a dam breaking as things people wanted to do will be released. Do you agree? I think I agree in part. I think there are some regulatory approaches that are likely to be lessened or eased up from the Biden administration. However, there's a little bit of a risk when the Trump administration is moving toward executive orders that are saying, you know, for every one out, you have to take two back, or there needs to be enhanced transparency around what's being sent over to the Office of Management and Budget, or OIRA. The risk there is that if Biden starts undoing all of these, it makes for a very handy talking point for a hostile Republican Congress to go, well, he's opening the floodgates of regulation at a time when the economy is hurting so badly. And that, of course, then becomes a campaign issue. So I think while he does directionally want to move toward things the way they were under the Obama administration, it's entirely possible that he feels a little bit handcuffed to some of the things that Trump has done. And unless he's able to artfully modify them, it may be difficult to wholesale reverse them. The other question too is, when do these things get reversed? There is a extraordinarily long laundry list of things that a Biden administration wants to do. It's going to be difficult to do them all on day one. So it may be that there are waves or phases of action that the administration seeks to implement. Finally, building though, and I think I say this to last because there's a lot that the Biden administration wants to do. Some of this, as I just said, is going to be able to be done very, very quickly. For example, COVID-19 and implementing a COVID strategy is going to be one of those day one activities. It's already started. There's already plans that are being made and made transparent. From what I've seen, not a significant amount of that has to do with the FDA, though we will talk about a few of the elements that are later. I think long-term though, and thinking about a Biden administration year, say 2 to 4, that's where we start seeing some of the signature initiatives that a Biden administration has been thinking about or talking about for quite a while, including a focus on cancer. That's been a central part of Joe Biden's policy approach for the last number of years, including the Biden Moonshot Initiative that passed under the 21st Century Cures Act in 2016 after the tragic death of Joe Biden's son, Beau. I would expect oncology and cancer policy to be really a hallmark and center point for his approach to the FDA. Alzheimer's disease is also something that Joe Biden mentioned in his kind of victory acceptance speech on not quite election night, but election night on Saturday when the results were actually in. That may be another opportunity for there to be action within the FDA. I would expect a lot of that is also falling out of the CDC and NIH, but there have been some policies talked about for a while now where if we have an oncology center of excellence and we have a digital health center of excellence, do we see a neurology or neuroscience center of excellence to deal with things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases that are representing such an extraordinary social cost to the US and our country? So let's shift gears just a little bit. So Joe Biden has not said an enormous amount about the FDA. And as I said at the outset, that's not necessarily unusual. There is, in any presidential administration, things that are very high value political targets. And that seems to be things like, what are you doing with Obamacare, or what's going to happen with the ACA and things like that. The FDA is typically not one of those things which winds up being a massive point of contention in an election, unless it has to do with something like access to abortion or abortion drugs or a scandal at the FDA. So it's not necessarily surprising. Now, that being said, there are some issues which have really come up. And one of those has to do with vaccines and vaccine access. And that's no surprise, seeing and hearing what we have from the administration, pardon me, in the last few months around, is the FDA being pressured to approve a vaccine more quickly than it would otherwise like, and not being able to release certain policy that it thought would better illuminate its policies on standards for emergency use authorization for a vaccine. What Biden said in his transition website, or on his transition website, is the following. And I try not to read too much from slides, but I think this one is worth just reading in full. As we enter the height of the political season, politics should play no role in determining the safety and efficacy of a vaccine. The following three principles should guide us: put scientists in charge of all decisions on safety and efficacy, publicly release clinical data for any vaccine the FDA approves, and authorize career staff to write a written report for public review and permit them to appear before Congress. Now, this may look a little bit anodyne. It may look like, of course, President-elect Joe Biden is saying this. There's nothing here that's all that unusual. There are two things here that I would point out, though. One is publicly release clinical data for any vaccine. Typically, the FDA does not release at least most of the clinical data on which approval was based for a product. And that's because it has very tight, restrictive regulations and limitations on the commercially confidential or trade secret information that it can make available. So therefore, depending on what Joe Biden is talking about here, and there is room for ambiguity or interpretation, if he is talking about releasing the full clinical data set for some of these vaccines, that could put the FDA more in line with other countries like regions like the European Union, where the European Medicines Agency has really sought to open the doors toward transparency. And that may make for an interesting precedent for the release of other clinical data for other products long term. The other thing I would say here is that a written report for public review is something that FDA typically already does through its clinical kind of summary or approval summaries that are released very often either simultaneously or within days of the FDA making an approval decision. So that part isn't so much novel or new, and most of us who kind of work within the regulatory affairs or regulatory intelligence space are extremely well familiar with that. However, the part where the FDA is going to be permitted to appear before Congress, that may mark a bit of a change. Under the Trump administration, many of those officials were perhaps discouraged from doing so, and we very often only saw Han testifying to Congress. On the other hand, though, I can't imagine most FDA officials are eager to go up before a congressional subcommittee for hours of hearings about whether or not they were politically pressured to make a particular decision. That is not a particularly comfortable hearing kind of opportunity for them. Now, there are other policies that Biden has spoken to. I think some of these are obviously connected to the FDA. Some of them are more tangentially related to the FDA. I think one that's on my radar as just kind of an interesting little twist on FDA involvement here is limiting launch prices for drugs and using international reference pricing. Now, you think about drug pricing and very often your first thought is like, well, that's an HHS issue. That's a CMS issue. FDA doesn't deal with drug pricing at all. However, what the FDA does deal with is the review of novel products, and what the FDA has, or rather the Congressional Budget Office has said is that in the past, if you do have drug pricing controls, that's necessarily going to lead to less novel drugs being developed, and will also lead to fewer non-novel drugs being developed or sought for approval. And that in turn has secondary effects on the FDA, which collects user fee amounts from industry and uses that to help fund its regulatory activities, including hiring staff and making infrastructure improvements at the agency. So long term, if there is let's say, substantial drug pricing effort to either tie to international reference pricing or otherwise reduce the price of drugs, that could in turn affect the FDA and lead to different discussions around user fee amounts and authorizations and so on and so forth. I think the other interesting thing that really caught my mind around drug pricing is the creation of an ICER-like body, a drug value assessment entity that would assess the value of products. And in the US, we don't have a government sanctioned one of these. Like in the UK, they have their NICE body, the National Institute of Care Excellence. I think I'm leaving out one part of that name. Germany has one called IQWiG. If we do start to see that in the US, I think, again, implications for the FDA. You'll essentially have a quasi-governmental, officially sanctioned body that may be second-guessing some of the FDA's own approval decisions. And as many of you know, the FDA frequently makes approval decisions on not a whole lot of clinical data. There are plenty of drugs which have been approved on the basis of pivotal trials, including fewer than 100 patients in those trials. That does not give a whole lot of data to an ICER-like board for them to be able to review these. Laura, let me bring you in here around promoting the production and domestic products and PPE and things related to devices, anything that you're particularly paying attention to.
Right. So for sure, we have already discussed a little bit in answer to a question that the Biden administration during the campaign, and this has been a long established position of Joe Biden as a politician, is very pro-Buy American, pro-home manufacturing. And especially with the challenges that we've seen sourcing products like personal protective equipment and other medical devices that are used in the response, but maybe not particularly the treatment, or even things like components of diagnostic kits and the sourcing issues that we've seen, especially given the global perspective of this pandemic. I think this is one of the top post-mortem type of initiatives that will really seek from a Biden administration. And this, we've already seen a little bit of movement towards this in the Trump administration, but from a Biden administration, especially given the kind of nitty-gritty policy of home manufacturing that Biden has, showcased over his career, that we would see a lot of sourcing try to come domestically.
All right, thanks, Laura. The only other one I'll highlight on here, because I'm sure you've read a lot of these already, and we've already talked about drug importation, is support for efforts to accelerate market entry for generic drugs. And point against the Biden administration here, if you go to their website, they call for essentially the passage of the CREATES Act, which would limit the use of risk evaluation mitigation strategies to prevent the entry of generic drugs. That provision already passed into law. So, they're supporting something that is now status quo. However, I think they're likely to look at other opportunities to accelerate this. And to be fair, this is something that was really highlighted under Scott Gottlieb, has kind of continued on under Commissioner Hahn. There may be more work for them to do, although I think many of the large targets around this have certainly gone away, but there could be some additional ones around potentially citizen petitions known as 505Q petitions. For anyone who doesn't speak FDA Orange Book, that is essentially a petition to delay or deny approval of a product that is used frequently by some brand name manufacturers. So let's shift gears a little bit, and I'm mindful of the time and want to leave a lot of time at the end for questions. But a coordinated response to COVID-19, as we said, is going to be issue number one for a Biden administration. And I think on the vaccine side, for me, Pfizer's news this week that they have extraordinarily positive clinical data coming out about their mRNA vaccine increases exponentially the chances that Joe Biden is going to enter office with, at the very least, a authorized emergency use authorized vaccine for use, potentially even a vaccine approval, depending on how fast the FDA wants to move between an EUA issuance and an actual approval decision, and how fast Pfizer can physically get a biologics licensing application together into the FDA and have that reviewed. I think it goes without saying, Biden is going to be overseeing a operationally, logistically challenging time where the FDA is not necessarily at the center of things, but HHS and the CDC, as they start to distribute these vaccines, that's going to be real challenging. And following that challenge, there is, of course, going to be the challenge of monitoring the efficacy and safety of these vaccines through real-world evidence systems, including the FDA's Sentinel system, its BEST system, its vaccine adverse event reporting systems. There's going to be a lot of data out there, and making sense of that quickly and accurately is going to be important, just as, by the way, the other side of that, as people are misinterpreting data that's in those adverse event reports, which are by and large made public, the FDA is probably going to have to play defense as well, saying, yes, there is a correlation, or there is an adverse event report is out there that this person received a vaccine and then got autism, but those two things are not intrinsically linked, and therefore let the experts kind of weigh on this first. Laura, I want to bring you in on the test, track, and trace aspect of this, because there is quite a lot that the FDA is looking at as relates to diagnostics, testing, and other medical devices. What's on your mind in terms of those early days of the Biden administration?
Absolutely. So we have seen out of the Biden administration a kind of comprehensive strategy, which to this point has been a little bit missing in the COVID response, towards moving towards increased access to tests. We've obviously have an awful lot of tests on the market now, but increased access to tests and getting people tests where they are. And then the big part of this in this first bucket for me is our more data. So as of now, if we're moving towards increased access to tests, then we're moving out of highly specialized areas. And obviously there are limitations to data sharing in and out of CLIA laboratories, clinical laboratory improvement amendment laboratories, just clinical laboratories. There are challenges there that exist already, but moving testing out of those laboratories and out of those kind of well-established settings and into people's homes and point of care and broader access to tests. The data strategy and being able to report right now, the FDA does not require as a condition of emergency use authorization that there is a reporting mechanism on tests. We know that Tim Stenzel, who you've mentioned earlier, Alec, is recommending to manufacturers and hoping that manufacturers will include a reporting mechanism in their tests. However, that's right now not under the purview of the FDA. So I think in a new coordinated COVID-19 response situation, there's going to need to be a broader kind of collaboration between the public health reporting authorities and what is expected from diagnostic manufacturers at the point of FDA authorization. And we've already seen a little bit of movement towards that with, I believe we're calling it the hashtag COVID-19 Designathon, which is currently a joint venture out of the administration. And then going into this next bullet, a significant problem that will be facing the Biden administration, and this is not, it is a top of mind day one problem, I would say, is how we move away from the emergency use authorization. So as we know, emergency use authorizations don't actually require the public health emergency. They're a separate authority, but the transition away from emergency authorities has been something that's been percolating, at least in CDRH, the device center, for quite a while. How we move these tests from, because the significant majority of all emergency use authorizations have been given to diagnostic tests, and how we move these tests away from emergency authority into a full approval. The first test is going to be de novo, and then all similar technologies will be going after it in 510Ks. But also the outstanding question of what happens to a developer who has an EUA submitted that hasn't been authorized by the time that we move away from transition, and how we get these tests, especially those under the notification pathway, which is I have notified you that I validated my test and then I'm submitting my EUA. How do we get those off the market if we do not know where they are is a huge, huge consideration.
That small problem, how do you regulate that which you are not aware exists?
Which exists with the enforcement discretion products as well.
All right, so folks, we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to encourage you, as you do have questions, please ask them and we will do our best to answer them in real time. And in the spirit of doing that, we received one question. Are there policies or approaches that have been utilized during the pandemic that you see potentially carrying over to other applications? For example, the apparent increased use of emergency use authorization or others. That's a great question. I think each product area is going to have a little bit of their own kind of spin on this. One thing that I think is likely to stick around is probably the use of some of this kind of coordinated all hands on deck approaches for particular areas. The FDA, for example, through its coronavirus treatment acceleration program, has modeled that off of its real-time oncology review program. And it has been able to very, very quickly get some of these products reviewed to patients and out more quickly. So I would expect to, as I said earlier, with maybe like a center of excellence for neurology, we may see more of these pilot programs emerging in the near future. Laura, on the diagnostic side, anything that you would highlight there? Because Tim Stenzel has been talking about, well, I should say one other one, the issuance of guidance has become much, much more accelerated. And the FDA has put out something like 60 guidance documents that were not in any phase of planning out this year related to COVID. We've heard Jeff Shuren, who's the Center for Devices and Radiological Health Director, say this may be what they just start doing, where it's less of a, in the beginning of this guidance and more of a Q&A style guidance that comes out much more quickly. There are pluses and minuses to that. On one hand, it can be maddening to figure out what's changed from a guidance. On the other hand, much more responsive. Laura, your thoughts?
Yeah, in that similar vein, I would say the template use of templates as a quick review status, where we've seen the diagnostic policies have been changing in the FDA, CDRH, OHT7, the diagnostics office will just update a template, and that way they both can, pull people from seats in other review centers and say, here's an application, here's the template of what we wanted to see, in a way that really makes it much more iterative, much more quick moving. And that's especially for, they've definitely floated it in a couple of situations for especially the breakthrough device program. But of course that would require the issuance of templates. And then the other one I would say is obviously real world evidence and the lessons learned from A.B. Abernathy and her engagement with the evidence accelerators, and understanding kind of the ways in which the FDA would consider real world evidence, specifically as it comes to concurrent analyses and establishing a validated data set and understanding the data set itself and reproducibility of analysis, and kind of the way that coding is validated within systems like Sentinel.
Mm-hmm. Laura, I've got another one which is right in your wheelhouse. What is the FDA's view of LDT oversight today? Do they like the total control approach of the 2014 guidance, or are they more willing to work collaboratively on something like VALID? I'd like to think they've learned the lesson of dealing with thousands of submissions per year from laboratories, and that's just been on testing for one disease condition. This works very well within this chart on things that the FDA under a Biden administration are going to have to be thinking about come 2021.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's a fantastic question. From my perspective and what I've been hearing, and obviously we're kind of deep in the weeds on these issues, the FDA at this point is looking to move collaboratively towards it, rather than just issuing the 2014 kind of guidance as a rule. We do know that the VALID Act to reclassify and give brand new authority to the FDA on a very comprehensive level to move diagnostics into a situation that would potentially work better for diagnostics, that the FDA is deeply, deeply engaged in those conversations at this time. So I do believe that rather than the FDA kind of taking the reins and doing notice and comment that would just go back to the 2014 guidance, which is an option, I believe that on a path forward, they are looking to do something a little bit more collaboratively, in a way that will engage industry, in a way that will engage Congress, especially given everything that's kind of on their plates right now.
Mm-hmm. So a few of the other things that I wanted to highlight from the slide that we've had up for a few minutes now is just 2021 is user fee reauthorization season for a huge number of the FDA's programs. The Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA, is up. The Generic Drug User Fee Act, or GDUFA, is up. Medical Devices, or MDUFA, BSUFA, or the Biosimilar User Fee Act. There is going to be a lot of negotiating, a lot of policy happening. And I think that's a bit of a risk for the FDA at a time when it's so focused on COVID. Does it have enough time to really sit down and think through the broader implications of some of these policies? That could pose a long-term risk, because the FDA is just saying, what, sure, fine, whatever. There's a risk that it may not be able to meet its stated obligations. Now, on the plus side, for most of these user fee acts, FDA is already kind of well experienced with them. It's more about tinkering around the edges rather than rebuilding a program. On the other hand, though, for over-the-counter or non-prescription drugs, the FDA is essentially building the engine for the OTC User Fee Act in 2021. There's a massive amount that they're going to need to be doing. And that office has been pretty busy, and not necessarily on reviewing COVID therapeutics, though some of them may have been pulled in other departments as kind of extra bodies and seats. But the other side of that is hand sanitizer. There has been a massive FDA response trying to get more hand sanitizer onto the market, and the existing OTC staff have actually been quite busy both trying to review those products and provide some effective oversight into an area where there's been some pretty bad kind of a track record. So the last slide that we've got, and then I'll stop and try and answer any remaining questions that we have, is, as Joe Biden comes into the presidency, assuming, and I am assuming, and maybe this is a rational assumption, maybe it's not, is that there will be a divided Congress, that Democrats face at least long odds, though not impossible ones, to win both of the Senate seats that are open under the election in Georgia right now. And assuming we do have a divided Congress, what are some of the things that we're likely to see? I think COVID response is obviously issue number one. The extent of that cooperation or the extent of the COVID response that we do see is an open question. Some of that may be focused on the FDA. Certainly, most folks in Congress are looking to see something more economically focused, aid to people who have been affected by the coronavirus. So that may get a little bit dicey, but we're likely to see at least a minimal rescue package at some point. User fees, as I was just talking about, so I won't reiterate that too much. Laura touched on this earlier, but manufacturing security. We actually saw a huge number of Buy America, kind of American supply chain security bills in Congress during the last session by both Democrats and Republicans, and not necessarily fringe entities of either party, but rather kind of center of the road established folks as well. I would expect to see some of this kind of move forward, and maybe we don't see everything that Joe Biden wants, but it does seem to be an area where we can have some bipartisan agreement. Drug pricing, as we've talked about as well. The wild card aspect of this that I think folks should be a little bit concerned about is if we do have a divided Congress and there's not a whole lot of avenues for legislation to get through, does drug pricing legislation get introduced as kind of a package add-on to the user fee agreements that wind up getting passed? Every 5 years, we see it one of these massive packages, and every single time it starts off very small, and all of a sudden it becomes what I refer to as a Christmas tree. Everyone wants their ornament on there. The risk for industry is if this bill is seen as kind of being friendly toward industry, Democrats may say, you know what, if this is passing and it needs to pass, let's put on some drug pricing legislation elements into here and see what we can do and make sure that that gets through Congress. So keep an eye out for that. Of course, there's also the 21st Century Cures Act, and we had a webinar with Representatives Upton and DeGette a few months ago, and they said, this is still a priority for them in 2021. Part of it will likely deal with the pandemic, part of it will likely deal with data and interoperability, but keep an eye on that. And Laura, the VALID Act, for anyone on the call who doesn't know, the VALID Act is an attempt to kind of reconstitute, reimagine what regulation of diagnostics and comprehensively both IVDs and laboratory developed tests might look like. Are you still expecting to see the VALID Act in 2021, or and in what form if you do?
Absolutely. So we do know that, kind of the sponsors had hoped it's a bicameral bipartisan legislation that has kind of a long legislative and regulatory history, kind of unique that way. But it as of now, my sense in the sense of, our industry is that it's not if, it's when there is going to be some policy changes related to diagnostics. The VALID Act is, it was put briefly on pause in the strongest part of the pandemic. We know that meetings are happening again. We know that the agency is very engaged, and this is chugging forward. However, much you can't tinker with the engine while you fly the plane, Alec, is one of your favorite sayings. So kind of the movement on reclassification of diagnostics will need to wait until we're kind of out of the woods here. And given that we clearly have no idea what's happening, where it's going, that could take a while, but it is a top priority, we know, for Congress and also for the administration, and either way, with the administration and also for industry as well. So
fantastic. Movement. Well, everyone, we are at the top of the hour. I do want to thank all of you for joining us today. Unfortunately, Colleen's, while you can see her on video, her entire Zoom apparatus has crashed and she is unable to unmute herself. So in the interest of making sure that I can speak a little bit for her, we want to hear from you. If you enjoyed this presentation and want access to the slides so you can share them with your team or provide a few insights, please reach out to us, and in particular to Colleen Connolly. Her email is right here. If you have individual questions or very regulatory specific questions, feel free to email any of us. This is my actual email. You can actually reach me here. If you have anything that you thought, you know what, this is too specific, let me just follow up later. And of course, if you want to know more about AgencyIQ, if you want to get a demo or access to us, please email Colleen and we'll be happy to set something up. Otherwise, we are going to be having probably another one of these webinars in probably 3 to 4 weeks. So if you like this, please stay in touch. We'll be doing another one soon. And finally, we are in the works of developing our Fda forecast for 2021, all of the issues that we think are going to be most on the minds of regulators and industry in 2021. If you're interested in receiving a copy of that, again, I feel like a broken record here, but please reach out to Colleen. We'll be happy to put you on the distribution list for that. So without any further ado, thanks for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon, and take care.